I cannot wait for this interview to start. I was binging on Dr. Peterson's YouTube videos last night. He is so good. And then later today, in a couple hours, we got Kobe Jones, MLS star. And then a few hours after that, we got a fireside chat with Dennis and Ben Shapiro. Busy day. Well, this is PragerU Live. I'm Jared Sechel here today with a very special guest who will bring on screen in just a moment. It's Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and he's a clinical psychologist, creator of selfauthoring.com, which is in the copy of this post. I encourage everyone to visit it. And Dr. Peterson's also well known in the conservative world as a free speech advocate. Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for the invitation. Looking forward.
Where are you speaking to us today from?
I'm in my office in my house in Toronto, right downtown Toronto.
Very nice. So a lot of people in the conservative world, they really came to you through your vigorous defense of free speech. But I actually want to focus on today on psychology, because I think if people really internalized a lot of your wisdom, and if they binged on your YouTube videos the way I have in recent weeks, it would be tremendously helpful for them. So that's sort of the direction that today's interview will go, and really be from a psychology perspective, although I encourage all of our viewers to also look up Dr. Peterson's podcast appearances with Joe Rogan and Sam Harris, and he's really an amazing advocate for free speech, but today is going to be focused on psychology. So first, Dr. Peterson, can you tell us about self-authoring and maps of meaning?
Sure. Well, the self-authoring program is something that I've been working on with my colleagues for about 15 years, I guess. I started working on it in my Maps of Meaning class, actually, which is a class that I filmed for many of my videos on Jordan Peterson videos. It's a class about the psychology of narrative, about deep narrative and mythology and religious belief, and also about neuroscience. But because it's about narrative, and because it appears to me that people view their lives through a narrative frame and view the world through a narrative frame, I also encourage students to work on their own story, roughly speaking. And you need a story about your past and your present and your future that's coherent and articulate, and that serves you as a map to navigate those territories. And because that's really what a story is a map for navigation. And so I started having my students write an autobiography, and I produced a guide to that. I had them break their lives down into 6 major epochs or durations of time, and then to lay out for their own understanding the most important things that had happened to them in each of those epochs. Like before I went to kindergarten might be one, or my experience in elementary school, or my experience in junior high. And then to write about the most memorable and emotional moments, both positive and negative, that occurred over the course of each person's life. And also to write out a plan for the future that helped people look 3 to 5 years down the road, and to figure out what their life could be like if they were treating themselves like they were someone they cared for. And so then I get people to think about their friendships and their intimate relationships and their family and their career plans, their education, what they plan to do with their time outside of work, and such potential catastrophes as drug and alcohol use, how that can be regulated so that it won't cause trouble. And then to write for 15 minutes about what their life could be like without too much concern for grammar or structure, if everything was going optimally 3 to 5 years down the road. And then they write a countervision for about the same amount of time that describes how terrible things could be if they let their bad habits and resentment and anger take the upper hand and auger them into the ground. And we've experimented with that program with thousands of university students now, most particularly in a partnership with Dr. Michaela Schippers at the University of Rotterdam in the Erasmus Business School. We've given the program to thousands of students, and including at institutions in Canada, and it's produced about a 25% improvement in their academic performance and about a 20% dropout decrease. Go ahead.
Is it important that that people actually physically write this down and don't just think about it?
Yeah, well, the thing is writing is a form of thinking, and if you thought through it as deeply as you would when you were writing, you could also think through it. But part of the reason that writing is so useful is because it's the most sophisticated form of thinking. And the reason for that is that you can write something down, and then you can look at what you've written, and you have some free cognitive capacity once you've written it down, and you can analyze what you've written and edit it and make sure that it makes sense. What you're trying to do with your past is to imagine that you still have negative experiences that bother you, even though they're more than, say, 18 months old. That's a good rule of thumb. What that means is that there's information locked in those experiences that you need to free to update your story about the world or your map of the world, so that you can negotiate and orient yourself properly into the future. And so, while that's what those programs are designed to do, and they have a very powerful effect on people, there's research done by James Pennebaker, who I recently interviewed, who started some of the work underlying this project, although he wasn't working with me nor is now. He demonstrated 20 some years ago that people who wrote for 3 days in a row for 15 minutes about the things that bothered them the most, the worst things they ever did or the worst things that happened to them, showed quite marked improvements in physical health. And so that was part of the source for our development of this particular set of online exercises. So
does it say anything to you about our society, our culture, our schools, the time we're living in, that something like self-authoring has to exist? Is it unique to this age that young people have a lot of trouble processing memories, figuring out what they should do in the future, or has that been a problem forever for humanity?
Well, the faster your society changes, the more of a problem that is, especially with regards to the future. I mean, when in traditional societies, people do exactly the same thing that their parents did, really right down to the details. And so the problem of making a transition into a new role is solved by the continuation of often extremely rigid, although productive traditions. But our society changes so rapidly that you have to chart your own course. Now, the school systems were like the elementary, the secondary school systems were set up back in the late 1800s, and they were set up to train the children of workers, hypothetically, to become factory workers. People were flooding into the cities from the rural areas and going to work in the new factories. And, well, first of all, their children needed to be taken care of, and second, they needed to be educated for something other than a rural existence. And so the schools were set up in the late 1800s exactly to train the children of workers to be workers. Now, and that's why the desks are in a row, and why there are alarm bells, and why the model is basically factory. But now people have to chart their own course, and they have to be their own executives, say, or their own managers. That's one way of looking at it. And so they need a vision for the future that they can use to structure their movement forward. It's absolutely vital, because without that, people don't have anything to look forward to, so they have hardly any positive emotion, and they're swamped by chaos and uncertainty, so they have lots of negative emotion. And we've also found that the programs are particularly good for people who are particularly lost. And they're also particularly good for men, as it turns out. And maybe that's because right now men in secondary and post-secondary institutions tend to be underperforming women. Our tentative theory, is that men have to have their own plan if they're going to succeed at an enterprise or in an occupation. So,
and do women not?
Well, that's a tougher one. Women are more agreeable than men, and so it's possible that they're more amenable to working within institutions where the tasks are already laid out before them. It looks like that, and men are more antisocial and more rebellious than women on average by quite a substantial margin. And so these are only tentative ideas that we're playing with, but the fact is that men have been underperforming women in post-secondary institutions, and if they do the self-authoring program, the future authoring program, then they catch up or sometimes surpass the women. So now the women are operating at a higher level already. So,
all right, you hear that, men? catch up, go to
Yeah, that's right, guys.
selfauthoring.com.
That's right, man. Get your act together. Don't be such a weasel.
From a macro perspective, from a philosophical perspective, do you believe that everyone has a specific purpose or role to play in the world?
Well, they probably have multiple specific purposes and roles, but I think everyone knows that they have a purpose, so to speak, because when they stumble upon it and are engaged in something that's meaningful, then they're expressing that purpose. And you can tell when you're engaged in something meaningful. Everyone knows what it's like because your attention is fully captured and you're focused. And so part of what you want to do is pay attention to yourself and see what it is that captures your attention and improves your focus. I mean, some of that has to be voluntary. You have to discipline yourself, but each person's temperament orients them to a particular place in the world, and then the particulars of that place interact with your particulars to determine what it is that presents itself as your problem and your pathway forward. A huge part of establishing your identity is to find out what that pathway is and then to follow it honestly and in a disciplined manner. That's what gives your life meaning. And the sense of meaning is it's a real experience. It's not something epiphenomenal or secondary. It's that sense of meaning emerges when your nervous system is reporting to you that you're in the right place at the right time. And so it's definitely something to figure out and to take dead seriously. It's very, very important because, well, because life is difficult and because it entails a lot of suffering, you need positive meaning in order to sustain you through that, or you get corrupted by the suffering and then you become vicious and unproductive and unhappy and anxious and depressed and grief-stricken and all sorts of terrible things. So it's a crucial thing for people to sort out.
So from a micro perspective, how does someone go about finding meaning and identifying what their purpose is? How do they make sure that they're authoring the right story for themselves?
Well, I think let's think about it from a micro perspective. The first thing is that if you're going to rely on your own internal sense of meaning as a guiding mechanism, you have to be very careful that you stop lying to yourself and to other people. And the reason for that is that you build the internal mechanisms that orient you in the world in part through your speech and your actions. And if you're speaking improperly, if you're stating things that you know to be lies, not only will you come to believe them because you tend to come to believe what you say and write, but you'll also pathologize the internal mechanisms that orient you in the world. Because as you do something habitually, you rewire your nervous system. And so if you're habitually engaged in deceitful action or speech, then you'll warp and distort the mechanisms that orient you in the world, the perceptual mechanisms, the emotions, the motivations, and all of that. So the first thing you have to do is vow, I would say, is probably the proper word, that you're going to stop saying things that you know to be untrue and doing things that you know to be wrong. And you can start by ceasing to do those things that are embarrassing and weakening you, that you already know about, that you know that you could take action with regards to and to stop. And that'll clear up your vision. And then you have to ask yourself, as if you were engaged in dialogue with another person. You can do this in the morning. You say, well, I need to set up my day so that by tomorrow morning, things are better around me than they were this morning. And there's going to be some small things that need to be done. They might be on the order of making your bed or cleaning up your room or eating breakfast properly or apologizing to someone that you fought with or doing your homework or picking up that task at work that you've been avoiding. You'll find out very rapidly if you ask yourself, what is right in my way that I could straighten up and put in order to help straighten me out and to straighten out my surroundings. And if you do that diligently, day after day, week after week, and you combine that with the vow to stop deceiving yourself and other people, then you'll start making a much more habitable and productive space around you where you can live a much higher quality life. And then that'll start to expand out into the world. It's a very good trick.
You've spoken about the idea that suffering, and you just alluded to it, that suffering and limitation is sort of the price of being alive. It's the price of existence. What do you mean by that?
Well, I can tell you a little story, and that's probably the best way to think about it. So You're familiar with the comic book character Superman, I presume.
Yeah.
Well, back in the 30s, when Superman was first appeared on the scene, he could jump over tall buildings and he was very strong. But by the 1980s, he turned into this almost a figure that was almost indistinguishable from God, apart from the cape. And he could do anything. He could juggle planets. He could withstand hydrogen bombs. There was no limits to his power whatsoever. And so Superman got very boring because there's nothing interesting about a being that can do absolutely everything at any time, no matter what. There's no story. There's no being. And so what happened with Superman was that they had to first introduce limitations into his story. So they did that with this substance called kryptonite that would cripple him in various ways, because then the story of how he overcame the limitations imposed by that crippling chemical would be interesting, be worth telling. And then later they had to reboot Superman entirely because his excess of powers made it impossible for the storytellers to create an interesting world around him. And so there's something very interesting lurking in the bottom of all that, which is that in order for there to be anything of any interest, there has to be limitations built into it, partly so that you have something to struggle against, something to contend with, and something to build. Because if you're just a magic creature that can do anything at any point, then you have everything at your disposal immediately, and there's no reason for being or for action. So it seems like, from the most abstract philosophical sense, that if you want there to be something, you have to accept the limitations that go along with that. And I think there's something profoundly important about that observation that can help people reconcile themselves to their own limitations, which are often a source of great pain. The question is, how do you live in a limited life so that you can have a life, so that you can simultaneously have a life of very high quality and be happy that you're alive and that things exist? That's the ultimate religious question, I would say.
Well, that's exactly right, and it goes into your point about self-authoring and identifying what you should do with your future. Because when you're young, when you're a teenager, early 20s, it seems like the whole world's in front of you and you have unlimited potential, and then you eventually have to realize that you don't have unlimited potential. You actually have to sort of close the circle and leave some things off to the side and say, no, that's not mine. And the things inside the circle, this is mine.
Yes, well, that's what happens if you decide you're not going to be Peter Pan. You know, Peter Pan is the fairy tale character who doesn't want to leave anything of that childhood potential behind, but also never becomes anything except King of the Lost Boys because of that. And yeah, you have to undergo a disciplinary initiation, let's say, to take that potential and to shape it into one actual thing, after which you can broaden it out again. So you have to, and this usually happens in late adolescence and early adulthood, you have to undergo an apprenticeship of some sort to build yourself into something disciplined and useful. And then maybe you can come out the other end of that and broaden out your potential again. But there is this aspect of having to go through a keyhole before you get into the next room. People need to accept that. You need to accept a set of stringent limitations in order to discipline yourself and to shape yourself.
And the suffering element of it is that the only way to develop a full life is actually to limit yourself.
Yes, well, it's also, the suffering element is kind of built in because you have the limitations to begin with, but the way to transcend that, as far as I can tell, is to adopt responsibility. And because there isn't much difference between responsibility and meaning. So, practically speaking, you have a family. You get married, you have a partner so that you can tie your life together with that person and build something that's strong and of mutual lasting benefit. And you have a family and you have a career, and you try to do productive things in the world. You try to set yourself right and to set your family straight and to set the community straight, and hopefully in some small part at least to set the world straight, so that the sum total of unnecessary suffering is reduced, and so that you can reconcile all your limitations to yourself with the fact that you've been able to stand up underneath them and to move forward positively and respectably regardless. That's the key to self-esteem, not feeling good about yourself in some casual way, but to bear the burden of existence heroically and with dignity, and with capability, and to be someone that people can rely on in a time of crisis, and to be someone whose actions constitute the bedrock of the state. That's what you want to aim for. And it's in that pursuit that you'll find the sort of meaning that makes life something that you want to be, instead of something you fight against and are resentful about and perhaps even wish to destroy.
You mentioned this a little earlier. So you've said that if you have a memory that's older than 18 months that still evokes an emotional response, it means you haven't fully processed it. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, well, the question is, what is memory for? And people think, well, memory is to remember the past accurately, and that's not true, actually. Memory serves for you to map the past so that you can develop a map that enables you to move forward properly into the future. And that's why you say sometimes, well, I sure learned my lesson that time. I'm not going to do that again. Well, what that means is that you've encountered something unfortunate and painful. You've figured out what you did to increase the probability that such things will occur. You've decided you're not going to do those things again, and so now you can move forward into the future without falling into the same hole. And so let's say that a memory of a negative event in your past is something akin to the memory of a serious hole in the road or an obstacle that you ran into. And now you need to analyze how that came about so that you can avoid similar catastrophes in the future. And if the experience is still encoded in your mind with negative information, what that means is that you haven't built a framework of adaptation around it that has rendered such events harmless or unlikely in the future. So, for example, perhaps you were bullied in high school, and many of those memories are still painful. You have to figure out what it was about the situation and about how you conducted yourself. I would start with the situational analysis that made such things likely to occur, because you need to conduct yourself or organize your situation so that those things don't happen to you as you move forward. And if you get that right, then the pain associated with those memories will go away.
In your practice, I assume many of your patients are dealing with depression, and in seeing your patients hopefully come out of that depression eventually and begin to thrive, are there some general patterns or rules about how people can move from depression to happiness?
Well, sometimes one of the general rules is that they need to try an antidepressant. If their life is in reasonable order, and they have friends and they have an intimate relationship that they're happy with, and they have a career and so forth, if the fundamental structural elements of their life are in place, but they're still suffering and feeling that things are hopeless and that nothing's going to get better, even though they can't necessarily put their finger on any specific thing that they would change, then that can be a consequence of a psychophysiological illness that manifests itself as depression. If you analyze someone's life and you find that they're lacking in the necessities of a healthy life, they don't have any friends, they don't have a clear path forward for their career, they're unemployed, their family is disrupted, it isn't so much that they're depressed, but that they have a miserable, unhappy life, then what you start doing is helping the person work through putting the pieces back together and starting small. There's almost always something that someone can do to improve the situation that they're in, if they're willing to start small enough. And you start small and build incrementally, but that starts to feed back the same way that compound interest feeds back. But you have to start taking the things that you have around you that are within your control seriously, and understand that you can come to alter them. So sometimes it's a matter of building up the necessary skills. Sometimes it's a matter of changing, in some ways, the way that you look at the world or the way that you act in it. And sometimes it's a matter of turning to medical aid, because what's happening to you is actually something that's more appropriately dealt with physiologically than say, psychologically.
I really like your response of first, maybe you should be taking antidepressants, because there does seem to be there's not a taboo about seeing psychologists and therapists, but there does seem to be some societal taboo about actually taking drugs in order to fix depression. Do you sense that as well?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I've never had a client who came to me and asked for antidepressants. People are very loath to take them. They think it's a sign of weakness. And the thing is, it's true. It is a sign of weakness. But the thing is, people are vulnerable and fragile, and lots of things will happen to you as you progress through your life. The probability that you're going to go through the next 50 years without encountering at least one serious and perhaps chronic illness is very low. The issue is, what do you do about it? And the answer to that is whatever you have to in order to remain healthy. And if you're diabetic, that means you take your insulin. And if you're an alcoholic and developing cirrhosis, it means you stop drinking. And and if your thyroid gland is acting up, then you have to take the supplements necessary to cope with that. And the same is the case if you are suffering from excess anxiety or depression. You might need a pharmacological intervention. That doesn't take away from the necessity of personal responsibility. I mean, if you're fortunate and you're depressed, but your life is in good shape and the antidepressant works, then that's going to enable you to be responsible once again. I mean, people are loath to use a crutch because they feel that it casts aspersions on the perfection of their character. And as I said, that's true, but it's not a helpful idea because everyone is deeply flawed and vulnerable. And the issue is how you deal with it effectively as you move through life. And if you're fortunate enough so that you have a serious illness like depression and there's a pharmacological intervention that might help you, you can do yourself and your family and those people around you a big favor by moving towards health as rapidly as you can. It's tricky because
go on. Sorry.
They're not a cure; they're a tool. You have to learn to use them, and you need someone to help you learn to use them. But they can be very effective under some conditions, and often otherwise, in other situations, behavioral or cognitive or psychoanalytic interventions are equally or more appropriate or should be used as an adjunct.
The insulin analogy is great because if a diabetic said, no, I'm not taking insulin because it's a sign of weakness and I can beat this, people would call him nuts. But if you have a physiological imbalance that's causing anxiety or depression, as you said, there is sort of this belief in society that you sort of have to struggle through it before even thinking about taking any drugs.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a conscientious viewpoint. The viewpoint is you've got a problem and you should solve it on your own accord. And it's a perspective I have a lot of sympathy with, but it takes more than one rule to get through life, because suck it up and get on with it is a good rule, except when it doesn't work, and then you have to do something else. And if you're actually depressed, just trying hard is not going to get you through it. In fact, just trying hard might be one of the things that's producing it. So it requires a very careful situational analysis with each person, with each client, in order to determine what the best course forward is. But you take what you're offered in the way of a cure, and you act with gratitude that such a thing exists. And I've seen antidepressants have near miraculous effects on people. Usually there are people whose lives are in pretty good order and who are depressed anyways, because you can't expect a chemical to provide you with a job and friends, even though it might remove some of the obstacles that lie in front of you to achieving those goals.
Is there, in your experience, is there a common, nothing's universal, but is there sort of a general route to why people experience anxiety? What is it that, what common experience are people with anxiety experiencing that leads to anxiety?
Well, everybody experiences anxiety, and that's because we can be hurt. Anxiety is the natural response to threat or uncertainty. And threat is problematic because it indicates that you might get hurt. That's what the threat response is for. And anxiety signals that you might get hurt psychologically or physically. There's not as much difference between those two things that people think. And so there's every reason to be anxious. It just, in some people, it becomes overwhelming. And often that can be, at least in part, because of the way their nervous systems are tuned. Trait neuroticism is one of the fundamental personality traits, and it basically indexes sensitivity to threat and punishment. And some people are very, very sensitive to both. And that means that they're more reactive psychophysiologically to uncertainty and to danger than actually might be good for them in the medium to long run. Right? It's actually stopping them from engaging in activities that could be productive and positive for them. And so why people experience anxiety is no mystery at all. It's because they can be hurt. The real mystery is why people don't suffer from crippling anxiety all the time, given our fragility and our knowledge of it. And the answer to that is, in part, A, some people have more robust nervous systems, and B, you learn to develop competent skills and ways of framing the world that enable you to act in it so that the threat is radically reduced and so that good things happen to you. And sometimes that's the development of social skills. Sometimes it's a matter of pushing yourself slowly and carefully into situations that you're afraid of and that you're prone to avoid so that you can develop mastery over those situations. And that's another thing that happens in psychotherapy very frequently is you help people identify the things they're afraid of that are standing in their way, and then break those things down into small pieces so that they can practice approach. You have them fight with little tiny dragons before they fight with larger ones. And that's how people learn. You always learn in the face of a certain amount of fear and trepidation, but you learn nonetheless. And so what you're often doing in psychotherapy and what you can do in your own life is push yourself slowly and carefully to do things that you're avoiding that are standing in the way of your goals. And that's the key to continually expanding your competence and to transforming yourself. I mean, we know, for example, that if you put yourself in a new environment, new genes turn on in your nervous system and produce new structures. So it's as if pushing yourself to face the things that you're avoiding can turn you into, at least in part, can turn you into a new and stronger person. That's a hallmark central feature of successful psychotherapy, that and getting your story straight so that you know where you've been and you know where you're going. And you need to know where you're going because you experience almost all of your positive emotion in relationship to a defined goal, because happiness is not much different from noticing that you're making progress towards something valuable. And unless you've specified what's valuable to you, then you can't experience any real happiness except of the sort of most trivial, impulsive kind.
And this is our final question. You often speak about the wisdom we can find in biblical stories, and perhaps could you share for our audience one or two insights from a psychological perspective that you found in the creation story in Genesis?
Well, sure, I can tell you something very briefly about it. There's a scene in Genesis in the story of Adam and Eve where Eve delivers Adam the fateful apple, and he eats it. And it's the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and it's given to Eve by the snake. Well, the snake is a symbol of something that's threatening and unexpected. And the fruit that the snake delivers is the same as the gold that the dragon hoards. And what it means is that human beings find something of extreme value when they encounter something threatening and uncertain. And now the problem is that when you discover something of value, say some new piece of information that's transformative, it opens your eyes. And that can be very painful because unconsciousness can be calming and soothing. You don't see what's right in front of you, and so you don't see the danger. Well, what happens when Eve and Adam eat the fruit is that their eyes open and the scales fall from their eyes, and so they can really see for the first time. And that makes them, in some sense, like gods, which is what God had warned them about. Well, as soon as they open their eyes, however, they realize that they're naked. That's the first thing that happens. And to realize that you're naked is to realize that you're vulnerable and exposed to the world. And so then they immediately have to clothe themselves because they understand that their vulnerable nakedness poses a long-term threat. It's like they've discovered the future. They've discovered their own vulnerability, and that's also why they develop knowledge of death. And then they also develop the knowledge of good and evil as soon as they're aware that they're naked. And that took me a long time to figure out, but what it means is that as soon as you're aware of your own vulnerability, you know how you can be hurt, and you know how you can be threatened and hurt, and you know what can be taken away from you to exploit your own vulnerability. And as soon as you understand that, then you really understand how to hurt and torture other people. And as soon as you understand how to hurt and torture yourself and other people, then you've gone beyond the animal state, and now you're into the moral state where you have to distinguish between good and evil. And evil would be the exploitation of human vulnerability for the sake of the suffering that's produced. That's as good a definition as evil as any. And then all of a sudden, because people have woken up and because they've become self-conscious, they have to bear the burden of moral knowledge and self-conscious. They also have to work because they get thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And as soon as you discover the future, you discover your own vulnerability. You also discover that you have to work because you have to take care of yourself and your vulnerability, not only now, but also into the future. So that means you're constantly burdened with care as soon as you become self-conscious. And that's just a tiny fraction of what's embedded in that story.
That's amazing. The price
It
of
is. It's
the price
absolutely
of
amazing.
knowledge is limitation
Yes,
for
the
Adam and Eve.
price of knowledge is awareness of limitation. Yes, but also the ability to transcend that limitation. I mean, the entire corpus of the stories that are encapsulated in the Bible, and I'm going to be doing a series of lectures on the Bible starting in May, which I'll make available on YouTube. The biblical stories lay out the development of self-consciousness and the the plunging of the world into history as a consequence, but they also lay out uh, the pathway by which that vulnerability might be dealt with. And roughly speaking, that's the story of Christianity. But the story is that the way that you overcome vulnerability is by accepting it voluntarily and moving forward nonetheless. That's what it means to pick up the cross. It means to accept the burden of your limited mortality voluntarily, fully, without resentment and without shrinking away. And that by doing so, you bring light into the world, into your own life and into the world. And you transcend, well, perhaps if you don't transcend death itself, you at least transcend the terrors of death and your proclivity to take revenge for the horrors of existence, which is at least a good start.
Well, these are such useful insights, and everyone watching should visit Dr. Peterson's YouTube page, his Twitter, and go to selfauthoring.com. And Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for joining us. For everyone watching on Facebook and YouTube, we'll be cutting off in 30 or so seconds. So my next question to Dr. Peterson will probably get cut off in the middle, but at least I'll hear the whole. Yeah,
Can I offer something? Well,
sure.
if people are going to do the self-authoring program, I would say don't be afraid of it and do it badly. Like really, do a bad first draft. Scrawl it down. Don't torture yourself with doing it perfectly. Do it badly because then you can improve it. And a bad first draft of the life you want is way better than no plan at all.
Thank you so much for that and for joining us. And we'll cut off on Facebook in a second, but I'll ask you in the meantime.
Okay.
If schools were being created today, you said when they were created back in the 19th century, sort of the modern method of schooling,
Yeah.
they were created to accommodate people from rural America coming into the city, and they needed a certain structure to be
Yeah.
useful from a business
Yeah.
perspective. So if schools were
Yeah.
being created today in 2017, how would they look different than they do right now?
Well, they should teach people to be self-managing individuals fundamentally, and they should concentrate a lot more on the basic elements of literacy, because the use of language, the ability to speak, the ability to write, the ability to think, because in complex jobs in an ever-changing world, that's your quiver full of arrows. That's your tools. It's language that makes you powerful, unbelievably powerful if you can master language. It's the most potent weapon that has ever been developed, and it's one that can be used for the good. And so that's what it should be, focusing on the development of the competent individual, competent, aware, positive, forward-looking, stalwart, brave, all of those things.
Would the
That's the sort of people we want to produce.
would we be in classrooms still in this school model? Would there be bells and one teacher with a blackboard or whiteboard?
Well, I think that the technological possibilities that have been opened up by new technologies like the internet are going to radically reshape education. They're already doing that. I don't think there's any way of really seeing how that's going to happen. But no, I suspect that a lot of the institutions that we rely on now have had their day, and probably rightly so.
Well, yeah, just look at your YouTube channel. Look at PragerU, how
Right?
we're able to reach exponentially more people than any professor can in one physical classroom.
Yes, exactly. And exactly. And YouTube is a miracle in that regard because it gives the spoken word incredible reach.
Well, Dr. Peterson, this has been a real pleasure, and we're really looking forward to. I think we might actually still be on Facebook, so we'll just say this to our Facebook audience. We're
Okay.
really looking forward to having you in a PragerU video. We can't wait to bring your wisdom to the masses even more than
Yeah.
it already has been, so to speak.
Great. Well, I hope we can do that in May. That would be a good thing to aim at.
It would be great. And have you written any books before? Because I haven't looked for it, but I know if
I've
you've
written,
written
well,
any,
I wrote
I would devour